let us talk about the project-based learning. This is another type of student-centered learning. This method gives students opportunity to develop knowledge and skills by engaging them with the project, simulating the problems in the real world. This gives them exposure in terms of the challenges and the problem that they may face in their future career. The relevant projects are normally designed to be closely related to whatever that they're going to encounter in their working environment, which at the same time it is designed in the proper sequence when the relevant knowledge and skills are to be delivered. Sometimes may require some simplifications in terms of the project, scale down it to a manageable levels by the students, especially when it is constrained by the time that the students have to deal with the project. The purpose of this project-based learning is for the students to learn critical thinking skills and be competent to solve the problems. Now the lecturer here, the main function is to facilitate the learning process, such as connecting the activities, assessing the learning target, and also making sure that the students understand what the learning goals are and why they matter. I would say that by far, the project-based learning is the most common method used by most of the lecturers in the engineering program. Many will do this through the assignment, and then normally those project and assignment are acquired from the industry, simulating the problems in the industry for the students to deal with. Through this kind of project, the students not only learn about the relevant knowledge, they gain critical thinking skills, analytical skills, and problem solving, which at the same time they have exposure how would the real problems look like. And normally, engineering problems in the reality are not that straightforward. This requires them to analyze and translate them into something that can be imagined. This may also involve breaking down the problems into sub-problems in order to solve them one by one until solving the problems of the entire project. Remember, a part of the requirement of the OBE in engineering program is the complexity. We have complex problem solving. We have also complex engineering activities. This makes the project-based learning easy to have those elements. First, the project needs to be engineering-based. Second, it needs to reflect the actual problems in the working industry later. And then third, it should have the characteristics of complex engineering problem in accordance to the definitions of the IEA. Same goes to complex engineering activities. Only thing that the lecturer will need to have some exposures to the industrial practice. That's why it is a part of the requirement of the accreditation body that among the academic staff, there should be at least certain percentage having the professional status. The focus here is not the number of staff with professional status. They are looking into a mechanism to encourage the lecturer to have sufficient exposure to the industrial practice so that they can bring the problems from the real world into the class. Also at the same time, they encourage the knowledge transfer between those staff with industrial exposure with their junior lecturers. And also, there are mechanisms to encourage the junior lecturers to pursue for their professional status. One of the requirements of getting the professional status is that they have to gather sufficient working experience in the industry. I see now the system is in place, and having this system in place, the project-based learning can easily be conducted in many engineering programs. Through those having the real experience in the industry, they will know the standards and the requirements from the industry. including those specifications and regulations as required by the local authorities. This can be a part of the problem to be given to the students. Having the students to deal with all those, the students have early exposure to what is really happening in the industry, including the requirement by the local authorities. This can significantly help the students to be competitive among the fresh graduates, having this kind of knowledge. Next, let us talk about the steps of implementing the project-based learning. Normally, we will start with the essential questions. What we want the students to learn, what kind of knowledge and skills that we require the students to possess, and then we design the problems accordingly. The next step here, it will be designing a plan for the project. While designing the project, you need to imagine and simulate the process that students need to go through in order to complete the work. As far as you are concerned, you are looking into the elements that they're going to learn through those processes. Make sure those elements are relevant and meet the purpose of your initial objectives of having those projects. And then you create a schedule in order to monitor the students' progress. After that, you will need to monitor the students and the progress of the project. Then you're going to assess the outcome. Lastly, it will be the reflections. Evaluate the experience that the students go through, concluding the knowledge and skills learned by the students. If you observe this project-based learning and the problem-based learning, you will realize that there are something in common, which is the assessment of the outcome shall not be the final step. Normally, you should follow up with the reflections in order for the students to conclude their learning experience. Why is this so? Because when encounter this kind of project or the problem, students tend to pay more focus in completing the task, either solving the problem or carry out the project. Along the way, they need to quickly find informations, learn, and come up with the solutions in order to complete their work. The entire process takes time, and normally time is limited. They will have to quickly solve one problem followed by the others, chasing the schedule in order to complete the project on time. They may not have sufficient time to settle down and have a second thought, consolidating what they have learned, as their ultimate focus is completing the works. Therefore, I would say that this is equally important after you've done the assessment. It is for the students to recall the entire process that they have gone through and then take note of whatever that they have learned from the project. It is written here as the experience. That means it is not restricted with the knowledge only. It can also be the skills, technical skills, and also soft skills. Not only that, there are also components beyond the technical skills and the practical skills, such as the reality. What is the real problem looks like? What is the real solution looks like? What are the conditions? Any conflicting issues with the stakeholders? What are the requirements by the local authorities? What are the parties involved? How to best protect your interests against the other parties, and so on and so forth. There are so many considerations beyond the technical knowledge and skills. Because of having all these components incorporated in one project, the complexity is there. You will need to monitor and guide the students well in order to ensure the students can gain the most out of the project-based learning. Although project-based learning is most commonly used by the lecturers in the assignments and the project, you have to be very careful that the assignment that you give, even though having the characteristic of simulating the actual problem, this is not good enough to classify it as a project-based learning. it can be just mere assignment, not knowingly. Now, one of the important characteristics of the project-based learning is you will need to connect the activities in order to facilitate their learnings. This can be done by creating a schedule, break down the task to the students, setting milestones, and there shall be interim monitoring. This monitoring process needs to be something which is regulated and formal if possible. For example, you can deal with the interim presentations for them to report their progress. You will consider yourself as the superiors of the project, that they have to report their progress. Through this, you can quickly identify if the students have lost their focus and deviated from the intended learning process. Rectifications may be made immediately. What you see commonly happening among the assignments is given, the scope is given, the requirements are given, and then the due dates are set. The next thing that the lecturer knows, it will be the submissions of the students. Lecturer will do the evaluations and grade the students' performance. Now, if your assignment is in this mechanism, I would say that it is not really project-based learning. It is just certain assignment or task given to the students. Why is it so? Because the involvement of the lecturer simulating the learning process is very minimal. The advantages and the characteristic of the project-based learning has not been fully utilized, even though the assignment given is a real-life problem. So what you can do here is, if you have already this kind of assignment in hand, you can actually modify a bit to accommodate the steps here, transform them into a real project-based learning. This can boost their learning experience and you will see the impacts. Now, how can you modify your assignment? You may look into these 7 essential elements of the project-based learning. First is about the problem. The problem needs to be relatively challenging. It should be based on any meaningful problems that needs to be solved. There are questions to be answered or challenges to be addressed. And these kind of problems are normally real-life problems, where the students will have to spend effort in order to diagnose the problem and find the root cause. What appears to be problem are supposedly what they can see in the reality. They provide indications and characteristics of the root problems. There should be a process for the students to analyze those. Second essential element, it would be sustained inquiry. They will have to think critically about the driving questions, problems or challenges. Normally the problems can be rather complex, that the students will have to break down the problems into sub-problems, different layers of tasks to be accomplished in order to carry out the project. Identifying the problems, questions or the challenges, the students will have to find answers and other relevant resources. Therefore, they will need to find quality resources, apply learning, synthesize result, and develop a solution. Now, if you compare the project-based learning with the problem-based learning, you will see the scales of the problem, it will be relatively large. The problem-based learning, it can be at a smaller scale and more specific. However, when it comes to the project-based learning, first it is a real-life problem, and this particular project may be collective of various problems which needs to be resolved. Now, in terms of the amount of the effort, I would say it would be relatively large. It may also come to a state that deriving the questions and the problem may also require analysis, evaluations or testing. For example, students are given a project to design the water reticulation plant in the residential areas. You know that water reticulation plant will require the students to connect the pipes from the mains. The mains are the large water pipes from somewhere nearby connected to the respective residential areas. In order to ensure the water to flow, you will need the water pressure. You will need to know the water pressures from the mains and then design accordingly so that you have sufficient pressure reaching to the houses. You will require the real data since this is the actual problem. You might need to look at the elevations as well as look into the material used for the piping purposes. All this is going to influence your design and ultimately influence the water pressure that comes into the residence. Project-based learning is normally solutions-driven. The students will have to come up with the solutions meeting the requirements of those projects. Next is about the authenticity. We are talking about the real-world problems, something which is relevant. The problem needs to be real. The data and the information should also be real. For example, you are asked to design a building over a piece of land. You need to deal with the foundations and decide whether you need the shallow foundations or deep foundations. If it is deep foundations, what kind of foundations that you need? In order to resolve the project, most likely you have to pay a visit to the site, and probably you have to do some testing in order to determine the soil conditions. One of those is doing the Macintosh prop test in order to have some ideas about the soil conditions, compute the results, and decide which type of foundations are to be used. And then based on the data, let's say now deep foundation is to be used, you have to determine how deep you need to drive the pile into the soil. You might need to also observe any potential problems with the construction site, any issue with erosions, any issue with slope stability, and so on and so forth. All these are real-world problems, and this really required critical thinking skills, as whatever that you observe in the real world may eventually provide hints and informations for you to make good decisions. Next essential element is the student's voice and choice. Normally, the project-based learning is open-ended in nature. The real problems is given. There can be all sorts of solutions. The student should be allowed to make decisions about what they're going to use as the solutions. They should also be given opportunity to express their ideas and justify their solutions. This is one of the important elements for the project-based learning. If possible, there should be a dialogue between the lecturers and the students. The students may discuss among themselves and work out the solutions. During the progress monitoring, the students will have to present their intended solutions and justify. During the process, the lecturer may question their solutions in order to further stimulate their critical thinking skills. Through this process, any problem that the students overlook shall eventually be exposed. Normally, we do not encourage the lecturer giving the direct answers. Instead, the lecturer needs wisdom to facilitate the process so that they can figure out the problems and the solutions by themselves. The lecturer will have to encourage them to express their ideas, their concerns, and guide them to make decisions. Next is about the reflections. There should be time allocated for reflections, because our focus here is the learning process. When task is given, students are normally paying more attention in completing the task. However, from the education's point of view, this task and the project-based learning is a tool to stimulate learning. Therefore, we will need to guide the student back on their learning experience. helping them to consolidate what they have learned and to appreciate why it is important. Next, it will be critique and revision. We also encourage the students to give, receive, and apply feedback to revise, so that they can improve their final products. Lastly, is about the public product. The students can also make their work public by sharing, explaining, or presenting it to audience outside the classroom. For example, presenting their design to the practicing engineers, or involve the public when come to presenting the public products. Through this, the students can get the feedback from another perspectives, especially when come to the design. Normally, students tend to design from the perspective of the designer. The design may be appropriate to the designer, but may bring to some practicality issues when come to the contractor or the site engineers. There should be another perspective of thinkings, and probably they have to think from the perspective of the end user, who are the general public or the local authorities. It would be good that you involve the audience from outside of the classroom who are relevant. From there, the students gain a better perspective regarding what they have learned, and for them to have additional ideas whether their solutions has already accommodated that. What you see here, the problem-based learning is not something that really difficult to do, especially when we are very familiar with our current mode of assignment, especially courses in the third year and the final year. Normally, lecturers are encouraged to have the assignment simulating the actual problem. In fact, we have all this in place, just that it is still not full-fledged project-based learning. Then you can look into the critical elements and then do some minor adjustment so that it becomes a project-based learning. And remember, when you conduct this project-based learning, it should have the characteristic of student-centered learning. There should be a close monitoring between the teachers and the students. And you should also encourage the students with individual learning and collaborative works. If possible, you can actually send the student out, asking them to go to the respective local authorities, asking for the submissions requirements. The expectations and the requirement should theoretically be equivalent to the industrial standards. And then, as a lecturer, you will need to guide the students throughout the process. Don't just leave the student there, expecting they can work out everything. I would say this is the common mistake by the lecturer as far as the project-based learning is concerned. The second most common problems encountered, it would be there are no time allocated for the reflection. The entire process ended here, which is incomplete. The assessment of the learning outcome is not the final station. You will have to conclude the entire learning process here, especially when you have different group of students gain different knowledge. This is the obligations and the functions of the lecturer to consolidate all the learning experience gained by the students, get all the students to reflect and imagine the entire process. This is so that all the students will have imaginations and will have the ideas about collective learning in terms of the knowledge and skills gained through the project-based learning. And this is the most critical part that most lecturers missed. And that is the main difference between the project-based learning and the typical assignment or project.